This brand thought that they had plateaued. Revenue, profit, MER all flat for quite a while, but in reality, they were slowly dying, but didn't know it. See, they were a high LTV brand and they had excellent retention. That's usually a great place for a brand to be because every new customer that you add builds a recurring customer revenue base. And that's how things had been going for the first 3 years of the business. But by year 4, everything had stalled. They were actually losing money on most of the customers that they were acquiring. But based on the metrics they were looking at, they had no idea. I found all of this running a growth cash dash, a financial x-ray of a brand's real numbers. Fundamentally, for an e-commerce brand to be able to scale, you need to know your lifetime value of a customer as well as how much it costs to acquire a customer. But calculating those numbers are actually a lot more difficult than people realize. There are 3 common mistakes that businesses will make when trying to determine that ratio, and this brand was making all 3. So in this video, I'm going to explain to you how we figured out that there was a problem, the mistakes that this brand was making, and how to make sure that your brand isn't making them too. Let's get into it. So this is a supplement brand, sophisticated team, they've raised money, they have a really solid product with a lot of potential. And the retention is actually impressively high. People really like the product. They've been growing for the first few years, but things had plateaued around year 4. So they reached out to me to ask for help with their marketing targets, essentially looking at their attribution, understanding how much they should be spending on what channel. From their vantage point, the business was still relatively fine. Revenue was flat, MER was flat, profit was flat. It was just not scaling the way that it used to. So they wanted to know how to just shift around the ad dollars to kind of restart that momentum. But the first thing that struck me wasn't the attribution problem. It was more that they were seeing those flat figures despite the fact that they had really good retention. They were spending a lot on ads, but revenue had stopped climbing. So I think that's very strange. If they're acquiring so many customers, they should be able to keep on stacking the revenue. So what's going on? So I pull a big data dump and I break down all of their revenue by acquisition year. So in year 1, most of their revenue comes from year 1 customers. In year 2, most of the revenue comes from the year 2 customers, but they have a lot of the retention from year 1 customers too. And in year 3, the majority of the revenue comes from the year 3 customers, but they also still have year 2 and year 1 customers there. But in year 4, only about half of the revenue is coming from year 4 customers. A lot of the rest of the revenue is propped up by year 3, 2, and 1. And keep in mind, there's still year 1 customer revenue showing up 3 years later. So like I said, they had really good retention. So then it's obvious to me, okay, clearly something's going on with their acquisition ability, and that's why their revenue's fallen in year 4. So then I compare that revenue to the ad spend and the acquisition cost. Year 1, $40, pretty solid. Year 2, they nearly double their ad spend, and CAC only goes up from $40 to $45. That's fantastic. Year 3, they double their ad spend again, and CAC goes up from $45 to $70. A big jump, but given how much they were able to increase their ad spend, overall worth it. But in year 4, they actually dropped their ad spend, but CAC still nearly doubled. That was the source of all the problems. Their acquisition costs had shot up so high in year 4 that despite the fact that they were spending a lot on advertising, they weren't really getting any new customer revenue. But because they had so much old returning customer revenue, that propped up the revenue number overall, and that's why the MER made it look like everything was stable, but in reality their CAC had skyrocketed. Now you might think, okay, well they obviously should have been looking at their CAC, and I can understand why you'd think that. Yes, they should have, but in their case they had something that made it a little bit more confusing. A very significant amount of their revenue came from Amazon. And so they knew if they tried to calculate their CAC based on only the Shopify data, that would actually be very misleading. If all your revenue is on Shopify, then it's kind of straightforward to know what your CAC is. But when you're split across multiple channels, it becomes very messy to be able to determine that number. So for them, they just figured, let's look at MER. It's simple and available. That's why I'm not a fan of using MER as a metric. If anything, you would want to use a MER, your acquisition MER, because at the very least, that still focuses on the new customer revenue, which is the purpose of all the advertising dollars you're deploying. Though again, things still can get a little bit complicated because you don't always know what your new customer revenue from the Amazon side is. So the calculation when you're omnichannel can become a little bit more confusing. But even putting aside the confounding variable of the Amazon revenue, there were 3 things that affect most brands that make it difficult to know what an actual profitable scaling target is. The first one is knowing what your margins are. Knowing how much profit that you make on each product determines how much you can spend to acquire the customer. This is one of the most important numbers to be able to determine any of the metrics or targets in your business. And the truth is that most businesses actually determine this number incorrectly. A lot of founders will take this back of napkin sort of approach to it, where they'll take their price and then deduct the cost of the product from the supplier invoices, the shipping, some merchant fees, and think, okay, well, that's my break-even CAC. But there's actually a lot of complexity that goes into determining your inventory costs accurately. And if I'm being honest, most accountants are also very bad at actually determining this number. So it's understandable that a founder would miscalculate it too. Now in their case, what's interesting is that I knew that there was an error there before we even looked at their inventory costing. I figured it out because in our analysis, we'll look at the days inventory on hand. So how many days worth of sales of inventory are you holding? Most people will look at that number and just decide if you're holding too much or too little inventory. But with a little bit of experience, you know that there's another thing that it can indicate. So I asked them, what's your lead time on your inventory if you need to place a new order? They're like, oh, about 80 to 90 days. I'm like, okay, cool, that makes sense. And it seems like you keep on purchasing inventory because you don't have that much in the warehouse. And they're like, yeah, we need inventory. I'm like, okay, well, your days inventory on hand indicates that you're about 240 days, which is like 9-ish months of inventory. They're like, no, we definitely don't have that much. That can't be right. And that's how I knew the most likely reason that number was as high as it was, despite the fact that they didn't physically have the inventory available, was because the COGS number that they were using when they were doing their accounting was incorrect. In essence, every time that they made a sale, they were deducting an amount that was too low for what the actual value was. And that amount that they were deducting was what all their targets were based on. So already I know that the unit cost they're using is not accurate. I dig a little bit deeper and I realize that their Amazon and their Shopify COGS lines in their accounting is all blended together. So now we can't even calculate the profitability by channel or see where there are going to be issues from a margin perspective. See, getting your inventory costing right is crucial because you're setting your targets on how much you can spend to acquire a customer based on that number. Even your pricing is based on it. And I've seen it over and over, even with 8-figure brands, that this number is calculated incorrectly. So making sure this number is right is one of the most impactful decisions you can make for all the decisions you make in your business. The second issue that makes it very difficult to set the right targets is that even if you did calculate your CAC correctly, so you know your inventory costing, you also have to cover the other side of it, which is the LTV. Now, while if you're skilled enough, you can get a pretty accurate number for your inventory cost, the LTV side is very difficult. It's ultimately just an educated guess at what the future is going to look like, and in their case, they had two things that made it rather difficult. The first thing is that they were making a lot of different adjustments to what their retention structure looked like in terms of making improvements to the sorts of offers they were making to be able to retain more customers, but also on the acquisition side. In most cases, the way that you determine your LTV is you'll pull a Shopify cohort report and you'll look at what behavior has been like for customers in the past. The thing is that past behavior doesn't necessarily indicate what the future will look like. So just because the cohort from 7 months ago had a 12% retention at month 6 doesn't mean that this cohort that you acquired last month is also going to look the same way at month 6. And it gets worse the further out you actually calculate your LTV because of the fact that a month 12 cohort is now 13 months old. And the landscape of the environment is constantly changing with new competitors and new products. In their case, they had made a bunch of improvements to the retention behavior because of different things that they did with their subscription program. So their more recent month 3 behavior was a lot better than the old month 3. But they were assuming that that would extrapolate out. So the more recent month 6, which they didn't have data on since they made the improvements, would be better than the old month 6. That's a reasonable assumption, but you are taking a gamble on that. And the thing is that if you overestimate the LTV, then there are going to be customers that you acquire that will be lifetime unprofitable. In their case, there was an additional factor that made it even more confounded. They'd been testing a lot of front-end offers to be able to acquire new customers, and that was leading to a shift in the number of people that were taking the subscriptions. Historically, they had about a 50-50 subscription to one-time purchase ratio, but with a lot of the new customers they were acquiring on the new offer, that ratio had dropped a lot. So now only about 25 to 30% of the people were taking subscriptions. Naturally, subscription customers have much better LTV than the one-time purchasers. So if you had fewer subscribers per every batch of 100 customers, then that's also going to reflect in a lower LTV in the future. And your subscription to one-time purchase ratio is one of the only leading indicators of future LTV increases or decreases. On top of all that, like I mentioned, they had the additional challenge of having the halo effect on different channels where they don't have the same sort of retention data that they do from Shopify. It's easier to calculate what your LTV is going to be if all of your customers come on Shopify, but if a lot of customers go to buy from Amazon, then you don't have that sort of visibility. So they knew that as they were spending more on Meta and more on TikTok Shop, they were driving more revenue on Amazon, and so that value is real value. That contribution margin is a halo effect of the spend that you're deploying. But they didn't know how to factor that into what they were calculating on the Shopify side. If they set their targets solely on the Shopify LTV that they're able to calculate, they might be undershooting very heavily in terms of what they can afford to spend as they're scaling. Generally, I like to be able to gross up my Shopify calculated LTV with the margins that I know I'm capturing on the Amazon side, but to be able to do that effectively, I need to be able to see the margins broken up per channel. And in their case, they had it all blended together. So again, part of the reason that they just backed into MER instead of using CAC like they should have. So now we're stacking two mistakes. They had problems with calculating their unit cost, but they also had problems with calculating the value of each customer. They thought the products cost less than they did, and they thought they were capturing more value than they were. So you can already see where the problems are, but mistake number 3 made this even worse. The third mistake is one that a lot of brands make. It's actually a very important and in-depth topic, so I won't cover the whole thing right now. But the broader point is that even if you can calculate the perfectly accurate LTV as well as the cost per product, the profit on that customer determines how much you can spend to acquire the customer. But that number is your marginal CAC. How much can you spend to acquire the next customer? The number that everybody calculates is the average CAC. If you take all of the spend over a given month and you divide it by all of the customers that you acquired over that month, that gives you your average CAC number. But the thing is, you don't acquire every one of those customers at the same cost. cost. Some of those customers were acquired very cheaply, and as you upped your spend and acquired more and more customers more aggressively, they became increasingly more expensive. But if your average CAC is $80, that means that many of those customers were acquired at much less than 80, 20, 30, 40, but some of them were also acquired much more than 80, 90, 100, 110. And those customers were acquired at a lifetime loss. By the time your average CAC has hit your break even, that means that the entire cohort of customers that you acquired, they all break even on average. But that means that some of the very profitable ones had all of their profit wiped out by very unprofitable customers. And that's the mistake that almost every brand makes. They keep scaling past a point of profitability, past their marginal CAC, until they're close to their average CAC. But at that point, they've already wasted a ton of money acquiring customers they'll never break even on. So once we had done the math and kind of improved the estimate of the LTV as well as the inventory cost, we realized that their target CAC should have been around $90. But because of the way they'd done their math, they were running at a CAC of about $120. That means that an enormous amount of those customers were acquired at a lifetime loss. They would have been more profitable overall if they had just not bothered to acquire those customers. The challenge for them was that they didn't even realize that any of this was happening. They didn't know that they were undercosting their inventory. They didn't realize that they were overestimating the LTV, and they didn't realize they were misusing the CAC number that they'd calculated. And because they didn't realize that the problem was sitting over there in the math, they started seeking out other solutions that unfortunately made things even more complicated. They saw that their revenue wasn't growing and that they weren't actually getting the results they wanted, so they decided, okay, well, maybe Meta's just saturated and we have to start branching out to other channels. So they started cranking spend on Google and on TikTok and YouTube and promotions and influencers and sponsoring podcasts. But this sort of a panic move usually makes things a lot harder than it needs to be. Your costs are going to shoot up because almost every one of these channels is going to come with additional creative needs, a different media buyer. You start adding operational complexity because now you have to manage all of these different people. Not to mention they all have their own workflows for how the channels actually operate and the data that's needed. And then thirdly, you also add a whole bunch of attribution confusion, which is why they came to me to begin with. So they're spreading spend all over the place, desperately trying to restart a machine, not knowing that the unit economics was the core thing holding them back. And spreading out their spend on all these channels that are generally going to be less incremental and less effective than Meta is actually making the problem worse. And when I challenged them on this, they were kind of reluctant to accept that they might have spread themselves too thin. From their perspective, they were spending about $200,000 a month on Meta, and they felt like that was a pretty large amount, and therefore they plateaued and needed to branch out. And I told them that that's just a limiting belief. They think that they have plateaued on Meta or saturated it because they're only used to spending that amount. I told them that I work with another brand that's in a somewhat similar niche, also doing supplements, arguably a worse looking brand than theirs, and they're spending $200,000 a day versus their $200,000 a month. See, the right move in most cases is to just focus on a single channel and invest as much as you can in supporting that channel. Meta has the potential to scale to an enormous level, and what they needed to do was simplify their ad stack, not add all of this additional cost and confusion and attribution chaos, but just take as much money as they could, put it into the creative to make Meta work. So once we uncovered all of these various problems that existed, what was the game plan for them? Well, first we had to break up their profitability on a per channel basis. That way we could know what the Amazon halo was and then also go through the process of doing proper inventory costing. That would allow us to determine a better target from a margin perspective. We also did the analysis on the LTV side and factored in the Amazon halo. That allowed us to set more realistic break-even targets for their marginal CAC. From there, we were able to build out a scaling target table so that they were able to see how much lifetime profit would they be able to generate at different levels of ad spend and at different CAC targets. This meant that once the math was done, they had to pull back their CAC target by like 30 or 40%. That was obviously painful because it meant that revenue was going to go down, because anytime you pull back on ad spend, revenue is usually going to go down, but you're improving your lifetime profitability and the sustainability of the business. We also had to work on winding down a lot of those other channels where they were spreading themselves too thin and taking that budget and putting it into Meta. I also connected with a bunch of creative agencies so that they could actually ramp up the volume of creative to feed Meta. All of those moves together allowed them to right the ship, put in place the discipline necessary so that they could get back to scaling profitably. But the takeaway isn't that this brand didn't know what they were doing. A lot of the mistakes they were making are mistakes that I've seen over and over with much bigger brands too. The key is that the main metrics that most businesses are used to looking at, your revenue, your profit, your MER, those are way too simple. There is a lot of nuance as to how your business is doing, whether or not it's sustainable and what it can actually achieve if you know which metrics to break down and what to look at. That's why we run the Growth Cash Dash. It breaks down your historical data, crunches over 30 ecom finance KPIs, and identifies which ones are telling a story that you may not be aware of. Once you have the right data, you can sequence the steps accordingly so you can stop the ship from sinking and you can start scaling. If you're interested in getting a review like that for your brand, the link is in the description. But I hope you enjoyed this edition of our Cash Dash stories. Tune in for the next one. Take care.